This is Twit.
It seems really clear to me that one of the problems we have is that consumers don't really understand the notion of bandwidth. They haven't been trained. They haven't been taught. They don't get that, like, texting uses no bandwidth and watching a movie is completely different from texting or web surfing. So there isn't that notion. And so it seems to me that some of this is consumer expectation, which right now consumers have been pampered. They've been able to do pretty much everything they want to, but the system is getting stretched because the nature of what people do with the internet has dramatically changed in the last few years. And Netflix is like the poster child for where, for the driver of this change is suddenly now, hey, we want to be cord cutters. We don't want to have to watch television, when it's being broadcast. We want to just get it whenever we want it. Well, there is a real bandwidth cost for providing that flexibility, which at this point consumers have been insulated from. And so, for example, Brett, you're saying consumers want a fixed price bill. They don't want to pay extra based on their conduct. They just want internet connectivity. Yet what they're wanting to do is dramatically more expensive now than it was pre-Netflix. And so the model that the ISPs have come up with is, in trying to keep the consumer from having to pay as they go or pay for their actual usage, is to get the money which this bandwidth actually costs from the providers. And I mean, I can see the elegance of that solution because the providers have accounts with their consumers. Netflix has customers, and the customers are paying for the bandwidth, essentially. And the alternative is Leo's model, where the providers are never charged for the fact that they're just offering this content, but that means then that the end users have to be charged on a variable basis for how much content they use.
Exactly. And either model would work, but the consumers strongly prefer to have fixed bills. It's sort of like, let's go back to the analogy of the newspaper. When you get a newspaper that's thick with ads on a particular day, it's going to vary, on different days. You don't pay a different price for your subscription. Paper boy doesn't come and say, well, your paper's weighed more this month, I'm going to charge you a little bit more. What happens is the advertisers, the content providers in that context, make up the difference when they pay for those additional ads. They pay for the additional cost of those papers, and the consumer really likes this, and the advertisers think it's fair too. What's happening here, though, in the internet ecosystem is that companies like Google and Netflix are refusing to be the conduit for that. And well, okay, there's a legitimate argument as to how you want to do this, is how you want to get the bills paid, and keep the internet on. But what they're doing, instead of coming out and saying, okay, we have a controversy here, we have to figure out how we're going to make this get everything paid for. Instead, they're demonizing the ISPs, and they're claiming that the ISPs are evil for asking to be paid to deliver more services, and that's what's not fair.
I guess we've sort of seen a half step in the way cell bills have been arranged, where there are similar constraints. There's a limited amount of bandwidth. There's which a certain customer base has to share, and so there are bandwidth caps and variable plans which you use in order to try to match your consumption with a model that makes sense for the ISP. And this is why I brought up the idea of electricity, because consumers are actually used to paying a variable amount for their electric bill every month. And at this moment, there is no variability in what we pay for bandwidth to our ISP, but there is in the electricity that we use from our electrical utility provider.
And of course, I pay. The problem is not that I'm not paying for my access to the internet, or Google, or anybody isn't. We're all paying for our access to the internet. We pay through the nose for our access to the internet. It's that we don't want to have to pay the ISPs too. Why? It doesn't make any sense at all, Brett. You want us to shoulder a burden that you're unwilling to shoulder. You offer, as an internet service provider, free and open access to the internet, do you not?
Yes, we do.
Well, that's your offer, and it's got to cost you what it costs you.
Well, bandwidth costs money. Well,
I know. I pay for it. I have to pay you too?
Well, yes. It costs a tremendous amount of money to do this. We pay, until a couple of years ago, we were paying $100 per megabit per second per month for our bandwidth. When we made our direct connection to the internet, managed to get that cost down, we still wound up paying $20 per megabit per second per month. And that, it's a good price when you're out here in a rural area. This really costs money, and in order to keep the lights on, we do need somehow to cover the costs. Wherever that money, whatever revenue model you arrange, whether some of it flows, whether the customer pays for all of it, whether there's a meter running, whether there's a cap, whether some of it is fed back through the content providers, you just need a certain amount of money to keep the lights on for me to be able to pay my employees. I'm not being greedy here. I'm just trying to make the books balance, or I have to shut things down. So I'm not trying to be unfair. I don't think it's fair to demonize me for doing that. I'm open to different models, but what isn't going to work is to stretch the ISP farther and farther to the point where it can't stay in business.
Well, and my big concern is, as we all know, an open internet is what's created so much innovation and progress. And my problem is I do pay. I pay for everybody who watches every show, everybody who downloads every show. The cost is not negligible. We pay, of course, our provider. I'm not sure why I should support you in your business. Your customers need to pay a fair price. And the problem is not so much that, I don't know how I would pay every internet service provider for access to their customers. You want to charge the internet, your customers access to the internet, for internet access to the internet, and you want to charge me for access to your customers. That sounds like you've got a crappy business model, Brett. It's not my problem, because but I'll be honest with you, I can't do it. And what you're going to do is you're going to shut down every small content provider because every ISP comes to them and says, hey, would you like access to our customers? And by the way, your customers are not going to be very happy either, because all they're going to get access to is the big guys. So it seems to me that your business model is flawed, Brett.
Well, unfortunately, Leo, while I created a lot of technology that provides the service, I didn't create the business model for the internet. That was something which I kind of had to adopt and go along with based on what resources were available to me and what customers you want. And I understand your point of view and your position very well. Ultimately, to some extent, of course, it's your advertisers who are really paying the bills for you. Of course, and they're paying to reach the customers, and they may or may not be willing to pay to for extra.
Well, let's not use me then. Let's use the Electronic Frontier Foundation as an example, or a nonprofit that wants to be on the internet, wants to use the internet and it's been used very effectively to organize, to raise awareness. You're saying that any company that wants to be on the internet should have to pay for access to people at the other end?
Well, someone should pay for it, Leo.
Yes, your customers, because that's what they're paying for.
And again, my customers do pay a fixed fee per month, and that gives them a certain amount of access, whether or not the content provider is paying. If they want to access a nonprofit, whatever, the Red Cross, any nonprofit in the world, that will get them there. But when we're talking about very high bandwidth, high profit material, such as things like Netflix, then we, in order to do that, because it commands so many resources, one way to do that is to have a business model where revenue comes from the other side. Again, we could do it by billing the customers. We could do it with caps. There is a site out on the internet, though, which expresses tremendous frustration with that. Have you ever been to the Stop the Cap website?
Yeah, no, I understand that. And maybe customers are expecting too much, or maybe ISPs aren't willing to tell the truth to their customers. Yet I see so many countries like Scandinavia, South Korea, where they get ample bandwidth for very low costs. We pay an awful lot in this country for our access to the internet. Why is that?
Well, we're a bigger country. We geographically we're much more spread out. In some place like Korea, it's very easy to provide high speed internet access to everybody, extremely high speeds. Although in fact, if you look at the numbers, they're claiming gigabit access. In fact, most people never use anywhere near that much. The sum total of all of the human senses combined is about the amount is about the bandwidth of a T1 line.
Right.
But in fact, we have a large and difficult to span country. I have only one choice right now of fiber providers that I can hook to. I'm working right now on building hundreds of miles of microwave dishes out so that I have a second choice. And that costs money, and ultimately, like I said, I'm not trying to profiteer off of this. I'm just trying to pay the bills. Ultimately, the cost of doing that is has to come back to the consumer somehow. So I think what we're seeing here is that one of the things that network neutrality is really about is not so much the idea that people are going to censor, but just how do you structure a business model that's fair to everybody and works for everybody and doesn't doesn't exploit any one of the businesses that's in the chain between the person who creates the content and the end user. And it's a legitimate policy. I just wish there wasn't so much acrimony here.
Yeah, and I understand. I just feel like the risk, very real high risk, however benevolent you feel that Comcast is that the internet, as we think it was, maybe it was never designed this way, but I always thought of the internet as the idea was that bits can travel freely, openly to any other point on the internet, and the benefit to that to the country and to the users and to society is that all kinds of speech can be heard, all kinds of innovations can be created like Skype. And I worry very much that Comcast is not the benevolent company that you seem to think it is. I'm not worried about Brett Glass's ISP. I'm sure I don't have to worry about Lariat, but I worry a lot more about Comcast. I think you're wrong when you say there's no history of misbehavior. I think there's a long and checkered history of misbehavior. And I think that now, and I also understand that, and I would guess that you have a political bent that is against government regulation in general. And I understand people's reluctance to let the government get involved in any way on the internet. But I feel the government has created this problem by creating a lack of competition. Maybe the solution is to foster competition as opposed to regulate net neutrality.
Well, and I really do think we're going through an interesting phase where we're talking. What we're seeing is and we've discussed this on the podcast in the last few weeks, the notion of the commercialization of the internet. This was something that the three of us created effectively decades ago and sort of nursed and watched and fed, and we used email and brought this thing to birth essentially. And to me it almost seems inevitable that this is going to end up going commercial, that the internet is going to be turned into various forms of business. I mean,
so
like
Tim Wu says, it's a pendulum that swings between oligopoly and community. What do you, Brad? Do you think that community internet is a viable alternative to this?
Well, that's an interesting point, Leo.
In a way, you've created one, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, when I started Lariat back in 1992, I started it as a nonprofit. It was a nonprofit rural telecommunications cooperative, and it ran that way for 10 years. After the 10 years were up, the members of the cooperative decided they would rather buy from a private company that could get investment, that could go out and do some things that it was tough to do with a nonprofit. And most of all, they didn't feel like they were competent to really manage the thing. They weren't techies. And they didn't like the idea of being members of a co-op where they really didn't even know. They had a vote, but they didn't even really know what to vote for. They just wanted to pay for a product and have it be a good one. They wanted to have a choice of people to go to, if possible, for that product. So in a way, our users decided that rather than have this be a communal resource, that they wanted to encourage, entrepreneurship. They asked me and my wife if we would take it private, and so we did. And the privatization of the internet, by the way, at that point was well underway.
Right.
It started in the early 90s. And the moment, as a matter of fact, companies began getting on the internet left and right, it became inevitable that it was going to become privatized. What the internet became in the early 90s, and this was the vision, was that it would be a federation of privately owned networks that agreed to work together for out of mutual self-interest. It's a very heterogeneous federation of networks. It's full of, people talk about slow lanes and fast lanes. Well, it's full of fast lanes and slow lanes and in between lanes and back roads and special detours to try to get things to certain places faster. That's just the way that's the way the internet actually has always been. People talk about the idea of fast lanes and slow lanes as if it's something new, and the internet has always had them. It's always had prioritization for certain kinds of traffic, for instance. Yes, it's chaotic. Yes, it's it makes things less predictable. It's certainly less predictable than the Bell system was, when it guaranteed that your phone call was going to go through. But this chaos has led to wonderful things. And before we restrict it too much, we need to think about think about whether we're going to lose the benefits of this chaos, this creativity, and frankly this entrepreneurial drive that people will have in the hopes of making some money.
Well, and Leo, when you talk about regulation, you're talking about the government preventing these sorts of deals, right? I mean, enforcing neutrality.
And I think the subtext of this is that a lot of people who wish the FCC would protect an open internet believe that the FCC needs to adopt Title II of the Telecommunications Act, which would classify Brett and every other broadband provider as a telecommunications service, a common carrier. And I understand that Brett doesn't want that. I don't blame you. Although there isn't any evidence of how the FCC would enforce these rules. I mean, they're not required to enforce all the telecommunications rules. So
actually, Leo, I can speak to that as well, because it's kind of interesting. Title II. If you read Title II of the Telecommunications Act, all you need to do is go online and type in the following thing into following term into any search engine. Type in 47 space USC space 201. That will get you to the beginning of Title II of the Telecommunications Act, and you'll start to read. And one of the first things you'll see, the first couple of paragraphs in, you'll start to see that it talks about different kinds of telecommunications, how to classify the traffic according to who is calling whom, and prioritizing it and charging different amounts for it. All of the things that the network neutrality advocates don't want.
Right.
And that are built into that law. Once you adopt it, there are some parts of the law that the FCC claims it can ignore. It can't ignore that part. That part's mandatory. It basically, what Title II does is it regulates. It would try to regulate the internet as if it was a 19th century telephone company.
Right.
The rules don't fit at all. And while some people say maybe we want something a little more responsibility on the part of ISPs, and I don't object to that, because we now are filling a more and more important role in society. Title II is so wrong for this. As I said, 2 or 3 paragraphs in, you'll realize this is not the right way to go. If we're going to do something, it should be de novo, and it should be designed for the internet.
I agree with you on that. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get any of the above, but I'm really glad you could come on, Brett, and make your case, especially as somebody who is on the ground with this.